Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to take a look at the work of René Descartes. Now, Descartes himself is not exactly a contemporary author. He's from a couple of hundred years ago, but his reading is a very good way to get into this issue of skepticism. This question, is the world the way it seems, or is the world the way it appears to us? Phrased a little bit differently, or thinking about what's really the same issue a little bit differently. Are we in a dream? Can we be sure we're not in a dream? How do we know we're not in a dream? If we're thinking, say, in terms of Inception, or thinking in terms of the Matrix. How do we know that we're not in the Matrix or in some kind of computer simulation? This is really the issue that Descartes is dealing with in his work. So we're going to walk through that today, take a look at what's going on in there, and then yet this week we're going to take a look at a couple of other pieces that really go beyond what Descartes is doing here, but really are still on the same issue and intersect with what Descartes is doing in interesting ways. So Descartes is a great starting point, and in fact has been a starting point for an awful lot of thinking for a considerable amount of time. So Descartes himself was really a 17th century figure, known sometimes, some people regard him in this way as really the father of modern philosophy. Now, if you know anything about Cartesian coordinates, that's the same guy. He was involved in mathematics, philosophy, other subjects as well. He was made various contributions to sort of multiple sciences, which is not to say that his work is still sort of widely accepted, but in the 17th century when Descartes was working, there was a real shift going on in philosophy and just sort of the general worldview. There had been this medieval worldview that incorporated elements of Christian theology on the one hand and sort of classical philosophy from antiquity, from the ancient world, particularly the works of Aristotle on the other, and pulled those together into a kind of fusion, which often gets referred to broadly as scholasticism. These are interesting things to look up. I'm not going to talk too much about them. But it gave this whole worldview that in some ways characterized the Middle Ages. And leading up into the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of a lot of literature and other works and thinking in different sorts of ways. And then going into the 17th century, which is really the scientific revolution, which Descartes is one of the fairly early figures in, they really started proposing a different way of thinking about the world, a way that rejected a lot of the sort of scholastic medieval view, and instead started orienting us, us in general, towards what we would now consider the scientific worldview, one that tries to understand the world in terms of matter and motion, tries to see it mathematically or explain it mathematically in a lot of different ways, one that tries to get rid of a lot of concepts or ideas that we can't clearly explain in terms of trying to make them mathematically precise or trying to keep the explanations as simple as possible. So Descartes was very much a figure in this. And in fact, part of what you can see in our reading here in the Meditations is him precisely putting forward a somewhat skeptical program that really justifies giving up on certain older ideas if we can't find a really good reason to keep them around. So one thing I want to say is that for the various readings, I'm going to have a slide like this, typically, just sort of who this person is, we give you some kind of frame of reference. When were they active? What, if anything, are they known for? So some of the readings we have are from very sort of famous and influential people. Descartes is one of them. Some of the readings are actually from lesser known people, but they're still very interesting and they fit our subjects well, which is why I've got them in here. So something I want to say is that even though I'm giving you this as a way of providing some context and some kind of just frame of reference for you, don't include this information in forum posts, essays. It's really not relevant for that. So you don't have to say something like Descartes, who was a 17th century French philosopher. Don't do that, right? That's a waste of words for what you're trying to do in those papers. Instead, focus on the ideas, focus on the arguments, focus on the reasons. So I'm giving you this sort of bio slide as we go through, but I don't want to see this information being fed back to me. Right? This is information for you, not something to stick into a paper to fill in some space or something like that. Okay, so what are we going to see here? So these meditations on first philosophy, you may have encountered them in a different philosophy course if you've done it. If you do 17th century philosophy, you're almost certainly going to go back over the same ground. There are some other courses where it makes sense. You might have seen this in a Phil 1000 course, Introduction to Philosophy, or somewhere else. We're going to take a look at it for our purposes here. So what's going on? I'm trying to break this down a little bit topically for you, just give some extra organization. So he's going to introduce the method of systematic doubt, explain what that is, suggest that we could be in a dream, but that we must still exist. That sounds sort of funny, but we'll see what that is. And then argues that we know our minds best and that all knowledge is really a kind of judgment. And when we get into that third section, I'm going to consider a little bit more directly this question of whether or not we can know we are in a dream or aren't in a dream. This is something Descartes talks about in this piece, though in some sense, that's not his main focus. His main focus isn't trying to figure out if we really are in a dream or not. Instead, really, his main focus is trying to figure out what a basis for certain knowledge must be like. And so he talks about dreams and the possibility that we are in a dream or experiencing a dream as a way of introducing some skeptical doubts about what we take to be true. So first, this method of systematic doubt. What Descartes is ultimately trying to do here in the Meditations, and his intellectual project more generally was really interested in this, was precisely trying to lay secure foundations for knowledge. Right? How can we find the best ground upon which we can build the sciences, right? Our human knowledge more generally. And in fact, science, that word itself, is really just a Latin word meaning knowledge. So when we're thinking about the sciences, we're really just thinking about different parts of human knowledge. So this method of systematic doubt, what is it really? It is the regarding as false anything for which at least some reason for doubt exists. So what Descartes does here in this piece is really go through his various kinds of beliefs, and he thinks about what reason, if any, he has to doubt whether or not what he believes to be true is really true. He doesn't only reject beliefs that he finds good enough reason to actually regard as false, but rather if he can find any reason to doubt whether or not it's true, he will regard the belief as false. So ultimately, Descartes' project here, it's an epistemological project, it's a project in the theory of knowledge, and it's a foundational project. Descartes is trying to establish a foundation upon which our other beliefs may be built up. So we've got, well, what he is trying to get to is a foundation that, as he puts it one place, and I've taken these words slightly out of context, but if you just sort of look them up in the piece, you'll see what I mean. A foundation that is certain and indubitable. That is a foundation of beliefs that we are just can't doubt, right? That we're just so utterly certain are true. We are 100% positive that the foundational beliefs are true beliefs. And if we start from there, we can then build up secure knowledge. And he gives the analogy of building a building. You need a secure foundation. If you don't have a secure foundation and you try to build up on top of it, ultimately, everything you're building up on top of it is going to wind up being insecure. It's going to be subject to uncertainty. If there's an earthquake or some kind of disturbance or something, that whole structure might fall down. So you need a secure foundation to build upon. This is at least Descartes' view. This is an influential view in the theory of knowledge, though it's not the only view. There are some other views in the theory of knowledge as well that suggest really it's not finding a secure foundation for our knowledge that is what we should be doing. Rather, it's looking at knowledge more like a web or some kind of framework that really we judge it by how well it fits together, how well it coheres together, rather than starting in a good starting position and building up step by step on top of it. So we've got beliefs, we got the foundation, we got belief 1 on top of that, belief 2, it gets supported by belief 1, belief 3 is supported by belief 2, and of course this could keep going up. And really when we think about our knowledge, we have a lot more than 3 beliefs. The foundation itself is going to wind up being some sort of belief. So the diagram here is really just trying to give you some sense of what this idea is. So what Descartes is really trying to do, ultimately, is figure out what that foundation should be. So he is trying to find reasons to doubt what he believes, and then because he is trying to find that 100% certain foundation, he is just going to regard as false any belief that is not 100% certain. Anything he can find reason to doubt, he's going to regard for the time being as false, rather than thinking in terms of, okay, on balance, if I've got some reason to believe something's true and some reason to believe it's false, should I believe it's true or false? He's looking for, if I've got any reason to think it could be false, then I'm going to regard it as false. So what does he do? Well, he winds up looking at his categories of belief and rejecting really what turns out to be the bulk of his beliefs. And he even says in there, I could go through my beliefs one by one, but that would take too long. It would really take forever. Instead, I should think in more general terms. So he finds reason to doubt beliefs based on a sense experience. As he notes, while the beliefs of the senses are generally consistent, there are irregularities. Distant objects appear small, right? They appear smaller than we get up close to them. We're sometimes tricked. There are things like mirages and so on. Different people sometimes see different things. All right, we can't always be certain about our sensory experience. I don't know about you, but I've had this. You might hear something, but then upon investigation, you don't really see anything there, or you think you see something one way and then you sort of look again and you see it a different way. We just don't always get it right. Our sensory experience is a very important source of our knowledge, and Descartes acknowledges that, so we're going to have to think a little bit more carefully about exactly what we're giving up here, which we're going to get to. But it's not perfect, right? Our sensory experience does not 100% of the time report to us accurately. He also gives up on the belief that he is awake and not dreaming, right? As he notes, there's never any reliable way of distinguishing being awake from being asleep. And you can think about Cobb here when he's talking about Ariadne. As he notes, he says, dreams, they feel real when we're in them, right? It's only when we wake up that we realize something was actually strange. Even beliefs about mathematics and basic constituents of reality, that there are bodies located in space, that they are extended things, that time exists and moves along and so on. Descartes, after giving up beliefs in his sense experience and giving up a very wide array of beliefs about what the world's really like around him, he says, well, what about just the basic constituents of reality? That there are extended bodies. Right? Maybe the world isn't the way I think it is, but it certainly has to be made up of things that have length and breadth and depth and exist in space and time, don't they? He says, well, even there, maybe, just maybe, I could be wrong. He says, whenever I add 2 and 3, I get 5, right? Whether awake or dreaming. But he could be consistently mistaken in that. There could be some kind of error or issue going on. He might, feel fairly confident about it, but he is not 100% confident that even his other confidence when he's doing mathematics is ultimately justified. He realizes he could be wrong when he's doing that. Lastly, he also gives up the belief that an omnibenevolent God exists. Now this one, he sort of hedges his bets a little bit. Calling this sort of thing into question in the 17th century was tricky, I'll say. You've got the wars of the Reformation have occurred, and there's a considerable amount of religious violence. So Descartes himself, he sort of frames this as, well, look, it seems like, I've had this belief seemingly instilled in me for a very long time that God exists and is all good. And so that seems to be some kind of bulwark against the kind of skeptical concerns that he has here. So he's willing to give that up. He says, well, I could call that into doubt. The fact that at least sometimes I go wrong, at least sometimes I make mistakes, itself seems to suggest that perhaps there isn't an all-good, and I should add, all-powerful God, because such a being wouldn't want me to make mistakes, right? So the very fact that I make any mistakes itself might be taken as evidence that God doesn't exist, or at least as some reason to doubt that God exists. We're going to see that he perhaps not exactly backtracks on that, but he's reframes that problem. So we've got all these categories of beliefs. Beliefs about certain things and beliefs based on certain things. Now, just as a note here, when I was talking about philosophy as being concerned both with the particular as well as the general, and being particularly concerned with the general, we can think about what he's doing here as, in some way, doing good philosophy. So just think about the beliefs based on sense experience, right? We can think about particular beliefs we have based on our sensory experience. We can think about the particular categories of sensory experience we have, so sight, touch, hearing, smell, etc. But we can also think about very particular beliefs we have within those categories. So, I'm touching my desk right now and it feels a little bit cool. There's a particular belief I have, right? Am I right about that? Am I right that my desk is solid based on touch? If I licked it and it tasted a certain way, could I be certain that it really tastes that way? Now, of course, we can get caught in those particulars, and that's precisely where we could spend an awful lot of time and really never get through the whole catalog of our beliefs, because there's just so many of them. So instead of trying to deal with them one by one or even deal with senses individually, Descartes goes up to a high level of abstraction quite quickly and says, okay, let's just put beliefs based on sensory experience all in one category. And let's think about those. Are we always right about those? No. No, at least sometimes we go wrong. And because we at least sometimes go wrong, we have reason to at least doubt any particular belief based on our sensory experience. Right? The belief that we're awake rather than dreaming at any given particular time. He says, I certainly don't think I'm dreaming right now. But of course, and Descartes knows this, when I'm dreaming, I have exactly that same disposition. In the dream, I don't think I'm dreaming. And this is exactly what Cobb is getting, right? While you're in the dream, if you don't realize it's a dream, then it doesn't seem like a dream. It's only once you wake up or once something changes or gets odd that you realize something's wrong. Only then, because you've got some kind of reason to doubt that you're awake, do you come to believe that you're in a dream. And even there, how do we really know? And this is precisely where Inception introduces the notion of totems, which I've talked about in the Inception video. Some kind of way of guaranteeing, or probably weaker than that, supporting our belief that we're not in a dream. Okay, now coming back to this last point here about the belief that an omnibenevolent God exists. So Descartes wants to call that one into question. He says, the fact that I make mistakes, the fact that I'm imperfect, seems to suggest, or at least give some reason to think that a perfect God doesn't exist. Because if a perfect God existed, why would I be made in such a way that I could go wrong? I could mess things up. He says, well, this might be pretty controversial. Some people might not be willing to call that into doubt at all. They might say, I have no reason at all to doubt that God exists. So Descartes instead introduces the evil demon thought experiment. Rather than, in a sense, getting caught up on a theological controversy, as well as one that could be potentially dangerous for him, to put in writing, instead he introduces the evil demon. So rather than thinking about God potentially tricking us, right, intentionally, Descartes instead says, look, given that I can't be sure that I'm awake rather than dreaming, given that I can't be sure about what my sensory experience tells me, what can I really be certain of, right? How deep do these skeptical concerns go, right? And he says, well, to really figure that out, I should conduct a thought experiment. A thought experiment, I mentioned this in one of the earlier videos. In philosophy, we often conduct thought experiments. We really sort of make up a scenario of some sort that helps isolate some particular belief or issue and hopefully helps us show something. We're going to see more thought experiments as we go through the course. For instance, Robert Nozick's experience machine, which is a very well-known one. We're going to get around to that next week. So this thought experiment that Descartes introduces here, he's sort of playing around with this idea that perhaps God is out to trick us. He says, well, that would really suggest that God's not all good. Then again, what reason do I have to believe that God's not all, or that God is really all good? He says, okay, well, let's stick that on a shelf. Let's get rid of the controversy. Instead, let's just introduce the notion of an evil demon, right? Some not good being who intentionally is out to trick me. So he says, I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all he can to deceive me. He goes on, he says, I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely dreams that the demon has contrived as traps for my judgment. I shall consider myself as having no hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as having falsely believed that I had these things. Right? So the upshot of it is really a 17th century version of the Matrix. Really, this is what Descartes is offering. And when I was talking about the Matrix and talking about some of the themes in the course and saying, they might not really be as new as you think they are. Here in the 17th century, Descartes certainly doesn't have a good sense of computer programs and simulations of that sort. But he's got basically the same idea here, right? There's some evil, malicious being who is intentionally trying to trick me into believing that the world is one way, the way I experience it through my senses, the way it seems to me, the way it's presented to me, when really it's some other way. Now in the Matrix, that other way the world is that it's really, it's the future. Machines have taken over. Humans are now batteries, right? Which itself is sort of very odd kind of plot point. They just kind of throw in, oh yeah, they figured out some kind of fusion as well, so they can use humans as batteries. If the machines had mastered fusion, I don't see why they'd ever need to keep humans around. It seems like more trouble than it's worth. But let's stick that on the shelf. Right? It's sort of an interesting concern about the plot, but one that is not directly relevant to the topic we're interested in. So in the Matrix, it's the machines tricking all the humans into making them think that they're living in, the sort of late 20th century, in a world that is, well, the way it was roughly in 99. In Descartes' thought experiment, instead, this demon is trying to trick him into thinking that the world is, well, the way it was in the 17th century, but even a little bit further than that, in believing that there are physical objects, that Descartes even has a body, right? That Descartes is in any way like he thinks he is. Descartes is willing to go pretty deep with the skepticism, right? Why should I even believe there are physical objects at all, right? The demon could be tricking me about that. It could be that I'm some sort of disembodied spirit or something. Now, because the demon could exist, Descartes has reason to doubt basically everything he believed. Right? And this, again, that's that method of systematic doubt. Descartes is trying to find something he can believe 100%, right? Certainty, something he just can't doubt anymore. He introduces this notion of the evil demon, and if you really think about it, right, is it impossible for the evil demon to exist, to be out there tricking us? Maybe, right? Maybe you just can't bring yourself to doubt that you really have a body. But is it really impossible that we're plugged into the Matrix or stuck in a dream, or that there's some kind of evil demon tricking us? That the world is not quite the way it appears to us, or in fact could be quite radically different. Right? Descartes doesn't think so. He thinks it's at least possible, right? Now, he's not arguing it's probable. He's not saying, oh, we have really good evidence to think, in fact, the evil demon's out there, or that we're plugged into the matrix, or that we're stuck in a dream like Inception or something like that, right? Potentially, right? Like how Inception could go. Descartes' not doing that. He's not saying, here's the evidence that suggests this is really the case. Rather, he's just saying, it's possible this could be the case. And because it's at least possible that this is the case, I can't be sure that it's not the case, which means that I now have to effectively sort of give up my other beliefs because of the way I'm employing this method of systematic doubt. If he can find any reason to doubt that something is true, he's just going to regard it as false in his search for an indubitable certain foundation for the rest of his knowledge. Now, Descartes has called a lot of beliefs into question. In fact, the vast majority of his beliefs. And if you're following along with him, and Descartes really actually wants this out of the reader, take this seriously. Really put some time into this. These are supposed to be meditations on first philosophy, not just a thing to read and sort of skim and say, oh yeah, that's stupid, but to really try to take seriously. And Descartes himself, he was on when he wrote these, as he says near the outset, he set aside some time for himself. He was on, I'm recalling correctly off the top of my head, he was employed in some armies during the 17th century, though it's unclear if he ever actually saw a battle. It seems like he worked more like in the engineer corps or something like that. And he was on campaign and found himself in the winter somewhere with a bit of time to himself. He got a few days to himself, and so he found a little cottage with a little stove in it. And so he took time to really think about these issues. And it seems himself puts it, I've told myself I need to do this for a long time, and now I'm sort of a middle-aged guy. I really don't have an excuse. I really need to do this to try to drill down and find the most certain beliefs I have. With this evil demon thought experiment, this introduces at least some reason, when we're employing the method of systematic doubt, to regard the vast majority of our beliefs as false. So what's left? What does Descartes actually have reason to believe in using this method of systematic doubt and employing the evil demon thought experiment? Well, really this. I exist. In a different work of Descartes, not this one, it's famously presented as cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Here, it's the same idea, it just doesn't quite get that exact formulation. So Descartes recognizes that even though his experiences may not be veridical, there's a word you are unlikely to be familiar with just because it's a rarely used word. We don't tend to walk around talking about whether or not something's veridical or talking about veridicality in general. But really, what does this word mean? Truthful or corresponding to reality. So Descartes' experiences may not be veridical. They may not reveal reality as it actually is. But what he recognizes is that he still experiences them, right? They're his experiences. For him to experience anything, right? That might almost seem like an incomplete thought there. For him to experience, well, experience what? Anything, right? A sensory experience, to experience a belief or imagining something, to be tricked by the demon, anything at all, right? He has to exist, right? And that seems almost obvious, right? And in a way it does. This is exactly what Descartes is trying to do. We are so used to, when we're thinking about our beliefs, we think about the world around us, we think about what we get from our sensory experience, we think about all sorts of things we've been told and learned earlier. We have this whole framework of beliefs. And he says, okay, let's strip all that away because any of that could be wrong. Right? And again, if you think about his context of what he's trying to do and sort of pushing back against, I'll just sort of call it medieval worldview. He's saying, look, we've got this whole worldview and it all sort of interconnects and it coheres in a certain kind of way, but the whole thing could be wrong. Right? There could be a far more interesting, far better way of approaching these matters and thinking about the world. So if we really strip it down, right, we get down as far as we can go, we get as skeptical as we can, where's the bedrock? Where do we stop? Right? What can't we doubt anymore? That we exist, that each of us exists, right? From our own first-person point of view, even if we're stuck in the matrix or stuck in a dream, it just can't be the case that we don't exist, right? Each of us individually. for me to be stuck in a dream and to sort of mistake a dream for reality, or for me to be stuck in the matrix and mistake that for reality, or for me to be tricked by the evil demon into thinking that the world is one way when it's really a completely different way, I have to exist. I have to be there. I have to be the kind of thing that can be tricked. And so what is that? And this is where Descartes introduces some very famous lines, right? So what is Descartes? What are we as beings that can read what he wrote, although that could itself be its own, part of the dream or whatever? What are we, or what is he, right? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wants, refuses, and also imagines and senses, right? And he recognizes that he exists as long as he thinks, and that he's the same being who exists throughout his thinking process. He admits that when he stops thinking, say goes to sleep or something like that, he might blink out of existence. He might not exist anymore. But so long as he is thinking, so long as he's engaged in these sorts of activities, doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, wanting, refusing, imagining, sensing, he exists. Even if all of the contents of those activities are false, right? Even what he thinks he understands, even if that's false. Even if he mistakenly affirms things and denies things when he should do it the other way around. Even if he wants things that aren't real. Even if he senses things that aren't really there. He still has to be the one that exists to be making those mistakes, to be tricked in some sense. So he says, thought is the one thing that can't be separated from it. I exist. That is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. But perhaps no longer than that. For it might be that if I stopped thinking, I would stop existing. And I have to treat that possibility as though it were actual, because my present policy is to reject everything that isn't necessarily true. Strictly speaking, then, I am simply a thing that thinks, a mind or soul or intellect or reason, these being words whose meaning I've only just come to know. Still, I am a real existing thing. Descartes takes this as his bedrock. This is his foundational starting point. The cogito, I exist. I am a thinking thing. And one little bit, I haven't stuck it on the slide here, he entertains, he says, I exist, but what am I? Am I a rational animal? And then he rejects that. That's a view that traces back to Aristotle. That's how Aristotle defined humans. We are an animal, or a kind of animal, and the thing that marks us off from all the other ones is that we are rational. We're the rational animals. And so what Descartes is doing there is precisely taking this notion from Aristotle that was then ingrained in that scholastic medieval worldview, that sort of the university view, the learned view of the world. What are humans? The rational animals. He says, but what does that mean, right? What are animals exactly? Do we know that animals actually exist? I don't think so. What exactly does it mean to be rational versus not rational? Right? We can doubt these things. We can doubt what even Aristotle told us, even though he was held up along with certain figures from the Bible and passages from Scripture and so on. These were really held up in that medieval worldview as, in a sense, just being indubitable, right? Here are things to accept and believe in some sense, and not really call into question. That itself seems a little bit unfair, because there was a rich exchange of information in the medieval world, and serious questioning, interesting theological and philosophical disputes. But in the 17th century, when Descartes is writing, certain figures, himself included, came to regard what was going on as really insufficiently critical of the received intellectual system. Okay, so our bedrock, our foundation is that we are thinking things, right? That we have to exist even if everything else we believe is false. All right, that's the stopping point. We have to exist to doubt this way. And from there, what Descartes is trying to do is sort of build back up. Okay, there's our stopping point. There's our absolute foundation. We can't call into question that we exist, even if we're being tricked. So what else can we then build up on that foundation? Well, that we are things that doubt, right? He says, I'm a thinking thing. So, and I'm doubting everything. So I know that I'm a thing that doubts. I'm a thing that thinks. I'm the kind of thing that can entertain beliefs. I'm the kind of thing that can want to find a foundation for my certain beliefs, who can accept or reject certain things. I'm the kind of thing that has sensory experience, even if it's never veridical, even if it never accurately reports what the world around me is like. I'm still the kind of thing that has that kind of experience. So just for instance, just on that, Descartes really sort of pushing the limits of the imagination here, but he's saying things like, there might not be bodies, there might not be extended bodies in space, right? There might not be smells. He doesn't quite say this, but this is a version of what he's getting at, right? We smell things, right? A lot. Some people don't have a sense of smell, right? Or it's somehow changed or inhibited in some way, right? They smell differently or smell less than we do. What Descartes is getting at is really, there might not actually be smells. That might be something just sort of simulated somehow. There might not really be smells out there at all. And there's sort of actually an interesting little bit in The Matrix that just came to mind, where the character Mouse is sort of talking aloud, but talking to Neo especially on the Nebuchadnezzar when they're sort of eating the gruel that they have in the world, and he's talking about tasty wheat and chicken and the different tastes of things. He says, of course, how do the machines know what these things tasted like? How do we know they programmed them correctly? Right? How do we know things really actually tasted this way, right? Compared to what we experienced them tasting like in the Matrix. Descartes is really sort of pushing the limits here and saying, well, there might actually be whole categories of sensory experience that aren't real. Right? There might not be extension or solidity, right? There might not be any bodies at all. We might just be thinking disembodied things floating around in the ether or something. But there might not really be smells or sounds. Those might just be, I'll use the phrase, figments of our imagination, right? Somehow produced in us. Okay, so what does this get us to? Well, Descartes, on the basis of this, argues, or perhaps sort of merely asserts, that knowing is really a kind of judgment. That when we claim to know something, when we believe something, really what's going on here is that we have activity of our thought, our thinking, not our sensing. He also, one other thing I'll just sort of mention in here when I was talking about imagination, Descartes has a particular view of the imagination, that imagination is really producing some sort of image of the sensory properties of a thing. That's really what it is to imagine. Right? So if you imagine, I don't know, a scene from one of the films, or sort of close your eyes and you imagine yourself on a beach somewhere, or whatever, right? You call to mind the image of a famous actress or actor, or you think of the taste of a certain thing, or whatever it is. For Descartes, that's imagination, right? When we imagine something, we are, in some sense, trying to simulate the sensory properties of the thing. Thinking is broader than that. Imagining is one way of thinking, right? That's one particular kind of activity. So if you have thinking in general, and we've got imagining as one less general part of that. But then we also have judging, right? Judgment is something other than thinking or imagining. So when we judge things, right, we judge that something is true or false, that it's accurate or inaccurate. That's one activity we do. But unreflectively, what we tend to think we do is that we know things directly from our sense experience, right? That based on what we sense, what we see and hear and touch and smell and taste, we regard ourselves as knowing things about the world around us. Right? I really know that I'm sitting here giving this lecture right now. Why? Because I'm sitting in my chair and I feel that. I see the screen. I hear myself talking. I can feel my notes, right? I know I'm in my office when I look around at it and I see everything where it should be. So we in a sense think we've got this kind of direct line of communication from the world to our knowing, right? That directly from sensing something that we just know that it's there. But what Descartes is trying to get at is that our sense experience really just show us how things seem. that when we sense something, what we're getting is really some kind of information input, right? The fact that I'm seeing everything in my office, I'm hearing myself speak, right? I feel what's going on my desk and everything. That's giving me pieces of information. There is then a separate act of judgment, which often happens very quickly and automatically in many cases, or seemingly automatically. Though Descartes really doesn't have any sense of the subconscious here, which is sort of interesting. In the 17th century, 17th and 18th century was really the time that the whole notion that there could be thinking that we aren't aware of was just starting to get played around with. It wasn't really into the 19th, into really the early 20th century, that idea was taken really seriously. That there could be subconscious thinking or sort of automatic or reflexive thinking going on, or processes that we aren't fully aware of within our own psyche, our own mental life. And so we sense the world around us, we get the sensory information, and then based on that, we just sort of automatically judge what the world is like, whether or not that sensory information is accurately showing us how things are. And often, if we don't have reason to doubt what we're seeing, we just accept what we're seeing or hearing or tasting or smelling as accurate, as veridical, as telling us the way the world really is. Of course, if we're employing the method of systematic doubt, if we're trying to find that secure foundation, if we're only willing to accept either what is certain and undoubtable or indubitable, and what is built directly on that in steps that themselves really can't be doubted, then in fact we've got reason to reject what it is we're seeing, right, or hearing, or the information we get from our sensory experience. So Descartes' point here is that any knowledge claim, anytime we claim to know something, right? I know that today is, oh boy, I shouldn't have done this, Tuesday. Yeah, Tuesday. I know that my name is Carl. I know that I'm sitting in my office right now. I know I'm really giving this lecture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any of those claims are really an act of judgment. They're really acts of the mind, acts of thinking. They aren't acts of sensing. When we sense things going on in the world, we're getting information. We don't have some immediate and direct line of infallible knowledge to how things really are. Here Descartes gives the wax example, right, to illustrate his point. So in the wax example, he's, right, and again, put yourself in the 17th century context. He's sitting here in this cabin or whatever it is. He's got some candles, right? He's working by candlelight, at least sort of, in the evenings and so on. So he says, look, I've got some wax here. I've got some fresh wax, it's out of the honeycomb. It's got a certain smell to it. It's got a certain shape, which you can see I've drawn the example of wax here. It has certain sensory properties, and he sort of goes and he lists them. It smells a certain way, it feels a certain way, and it's cool to the touch, it's hard, it's got a certain shape, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to have all of these properties. Now, you put it by the fire, and the sensory properties change, right? And instead of being cool, it gets warm. Instead of being hard, it goes soft. Instead of having the shape it had, say it was a little, cube or something, right? It melts and turns into kind of a little puddle. The smell goes away. It might even taste different, right? When we do these sort of things, just think about cooking or baking, right? I don't know about you, I do these things, right? I cook and bake, and it's lovely. And it's wild in some ways, where you take certain ingredients and you mix them together in a certain kind of way, and then you heat them or cool them or whatever. And then the end product is this, right, seemingly like very different thing, right? You sort of mix together certain ingredients and you wind up getting a flavor profile or a certain kind of texture or something, just because it's gone through changes in a certain sort of order, which is very interesting, right? So Descartes' point here is that we've got this piece of wax. It has one set of sensory properties. Then we heat it up and it has a totally different set of sensory properties. Right? Like all of those properties have changed. Everything that we listed off in the first place about its size or shape or any of those sorts of properties is now different than it was. Is it the same piece of wax? He says nobody doubts it, right? We all believe it's the same piece of wax, right? How do we know that? given that all the sensory properties have changed. Of course, we see that it's gone through that process, which itself is sort of one more piece of sensory information. But what Descartes is trying to get at is that we believe it's the same piece of wax in both instances. And so what's really going on here is that we've got, and my diagram might be a little bit misleading here, perhaps, but we perceive the wax as having certain sensory properties, where it has a certain shape, a certain color, and so on. And then we perform an act of judgment, right? We say, and my sensory experience is telling me how things are, which leads us to this belief in the real wax. So we believe that the wax is really there. It's a real thing with sensory properties, even though those sensory properties can change. Right? That what the wax really is not just the sum of its sensory properties, but rather there's something more to it. There's some object there. There's some bearer of sensory properties. The properties themselves can change, but we know that there's really something out there. Right? So our knowing, when we claim to know something, this is really an act of thinking, an act of judging, an act of taking sensory information and evaluating it in a certain way to arrive at our beliefs about what's going on. Often these processes are basically automatic. We just often don't doubt what we see, right? And in fact, most people, including philosophers, most of the time, when we're walking around engaging the world, don't really doubt what we're seeing. When I walk down the street, right, I think I'm really walking down the street. Not that I'm plugged into the matrix or stuck in a dream or whatever. If I see a car heading, speeding towards me, I jump out of the way, right? If I see a red hot stove, my hand's going toward it, I try to pull it back because I know if I touch that thing, well, okay, I believe if I touch that thing, it's going to hurt an awful lot, right? Because I believe it's really there, right? And not that I'm stuck in the matrix or a dream or whatever. So ultimately, Descartes is saying, based on our sensory experience, we arrive at these beliefs about how the world is. Right? And we tend to believe that the world is really the way it seems to be, right? The way that is revealed to us via our sensory experience. Although our sensory experience is something that keeps changing, right? Just like the example of the wax shows. Right? Something might have one set of sensory properties at one time, a different set at another time, but we still go on believing that it's the same thing, even though it's not, it doesn't have the same set of sensory properties. So now, just thinking about this, really pulling this together and trying to apply it directly to what's going on in our films, right? What evidence do we have to support the judgment that the world really, is, that should be as it appears or seems to us, right? That we're not now dreaming, we're stuck in the matrix, or whatever the skeptical situation might be, right? Now, Descartes' suggestion so far, we really don't have any evidence like that, right? It's possible that we're being tricked by an evil demon, or stuck in the matrix, or in a dream, or insert your favorite scenario here, right? Really, the Matrix and the Dream, these are the two films we're dealing with. There are other versions of this that have been played around with in film and literature and so on. But the basic underlying idea is that the world is not the way it seems to us. It's not the way it appears. It's not the way our sensory experience tells us it is. Right? So really, so far, and then I need to stress this, this is only the first 2 meditations out of what are 6 meditations that Descartes gives us. And in these first 2, really what he's trying to get, in the first one, he's really laying out the reasons for us to be skeptical, to really admit that we don't really know with certainty what the world around us is like. In the second meditation, he's tried to hit his bedrock, find his foundation, right? I exist, I have to be the sort of thing that can be tricked and be wrong and hold false beliefs and doubt and search and so on. Now, so far, that doesn't get us back to how do we know what the world is like around us, right? All that gets us to is that we exist, that we're thinking things, that we're really there. But it could still be the case that everything else we believe about the world around us is wrong. Now, one suggestion here. So this is the suggestion I want to put out here, and I've mentioned this already in the video talking about what's going on in Matrix and Deception, right? We might point to the consistency of our experience as evidence that the world is the way it seems to us. Right? We say, look, generally speaking, our experience is pretty darn consistent. I'm here in my office and everything looks the way it should. There's no odd inconsistency in my experience. I went to sleep in my bed last night. I woke up in it this morning. I went about my daily routine. There's nothing particularly odd. No purple elephants, sitting in my living room, or evil clowns hiding in the shower or anything like that, right? It's just a normal day. Everything seems the way it normally does. My experience today is entirely consistent with what I recall my experience being in the past, what I remember. Right? Now, that itself doesn't actually yet get us quite anywhere, right? All that would be doing is remarking that my experience today seems to be consistent with what I remember, or believe I remember, my past experience being. Now, we need to pair that with some other kind of principle or approach. And in this case, what we can do is really invoke a principle or approach that says the simplest explanation is typically the best one. What's the simplest explanation for my consistent experience, right? Or what seems to me to be consistent experience. I want to stress that a little bit. Right? It seems to be consistent based on what I believe are memories of my past experience. So I can invoke something like this. The simplest explanation of my present experience being consistent with my past experience is that the world is really the way I perceive it to be, or much like it. Right? That really, when I look at my desk or look around my office and see different things, what I'm seeing is caused by what's really there. When I look at my desk and I see my desk and it looks the same today as it did yesterday, and it looks the same as it did the day before, and a week before, and the month before, and the year before that, is that it's really there, and that it really has certain properties or characteristics, and it's those properties or characteristics interacting with my body in a certain way through the light coming off it that cause me to have the kind of sensory perceptions that I do. Right? Seems like a pretty good theory, right? Now, of course, if we take Descartes' method of systematic doubt, we say, well, if you have any reason to doubt it, you have to reject it as false. Well, of course I have reason to reject it. As Descartes notes, as Cobb notes, as Morpheus notes at some point, if you're in a dream, you often don't realize that you're in one, right? Nothing stands out as odd or unusual. You can have a consistent set of experiences that are designed to be consistent in that way, right? Say the machines that run the matrix design it to be fairly consistent precisely so that we don't start doubting our world, precisely because we are just sort of geared to think in these terms, right? When things seem consistent, we don't tend to doubt them. But it could be the case, I can't rule out 100% that I'm in the matrix, or in a dream, or that the world isn't really the way I think it is. Right? I could be consistently wrong. I can't rule that out as a possibility. Now, just that, right? Possibility. It could be the case that the world's not the way it seems to me. But that's a different claim from, I have good reason to believe that the world is not the way it appears to me. Right? Part of this has to do with the way Descartes is approaching matters. Descartes is approaching matters, he's really in some sense weighing the scales ahead of time. He's saying, okay, normally when we're trying to figure out whether or not to believe something, we sort of weigh up evidence. So if I'm trying to regard a particular belief, trying to judge whether or not it's true or false, right? The world is the way it seems to me. Let's just take that. I should think of evidence on both sides, right? Evidence for, yes, that's true, or no, that's false, right? Reasons to believe that's true. The world is the way it seems to me. My experience is consistent. That's a pretty good one, right? I'm not sure which way I should be weighing the scales. I guess down would be heavier and so better, right? What Descartes is saying is really we should automatically sort of adjust our scales so that any piece of evidence on the contrary side, any piece of evidence that suggests that something could be false, just automatically, right, does our scales in such a way that it doesn't matter how much evidence we have on the side that says, oh, it's probably true, right? If we've got any reason at all to think that it could be false, if you stick anything on that side of the scales, then you need to regard it as false. But of course, that's a very particular way of approaching an issue like this, right? What should we believe? We don't normally do that. We don't say, oh, if I have any reason to believe that X is false, X being any belief whatsoever, then I should regard X as false. Instead, we tend to go, okay, is X true or false? Well, here are reasons to believe X is true. Here are reasons to believe X is false. How do those reasons, or how does that evidence stack up, right, which side is best supported, and then we put our belief on the side that's best supported, and often with a degree of certainty that is tied to that evidence, to the weight of the evidence. Right? If we have really, really, really strong evidence to regard the world around us as being the way it really seems to be, due to, say, its consistency over a vast amount of time and amongst a vast number of other people who we believe are real, though of course Descartes himself says, how do you really know? That seems like really good evidence, right? That indicates a high probability that the world's really the way it seems. But on the other side, can we really rule out that we're in a dream or anything like that? Right? Well, no, not 100% certainty. So there's always that little nagging doubt. If we had more and more evidence start stacking up on that other side, right? Our experience became less consistent, or all of a sudden there were parts of our experience that seemed to really suggest that we were in a dream or in the Matrix. We're, say, chased down by agents and have a tracking device put in us. We're being contacted by mysterious people. We have things showing up on our computer screens we can't easily explain. Or thinking about Cobb and Mal and Inception, Mal notes that Cobb's experience of what he takes to be reality seems to have a lot of the characteristics that experience in dreams tends to have, right? Being chased around by, agents, or, well, sort of not exactly agents, but what's akin to that in Inception, coming over from the Matrix, being chased around, being in some sense rejected, feeling hunted, odd, having experience, skip around, having all sorts of problems, right? Being uncertain about whether or not one's actually awake or dreaming, questions about how the totems operate and so on. So as we get more and more evidence on that side that suggests maybe things really aren't the way they are, that could really call into question whether or not we are now, whether or not we now have good reason or sufficient evidence to really think the world is not the way it seems. So a couple of upshots here. I know I was just sort of throwing out a lot of things there. What are our upshots here from Descartes? One, knowing is an act of judgment, not of sense. Our senses give us information that we can use, but it doesn't automatically tell us the way things really are. We can be wrong about any particular piece of sensory experience we have. We could also be wrong about our sensory experience as a whole. Once we move back to that level where we start to call into question whether or not the consistency of our sense experience itself actually counts in favor of our sense experience showing us the way the world really is, precisely because it's possible that there could be one or more beings out there, or even some part of our own minds, that is intentionally producing some kind of consistent experience for us, precisely with the aim of trying to trick us into believing that the world is one way when it's really a different way. Right? So our sensory experience, our senses give us information. They don't tell us how the world really is. There's room for doubt in there. Our claims to knowledge, right, our claims to know something, or what we believe and what we believe to be true or false, these are really acts of judgment. These are things we do in our thinking, even if we often don't put serious time and effort into it, that's something different from our mere sensory experience. If we employ the method of systematic doubt, if we regard as false anything we have reason to doubt is true, then in fact we need to regard as false that the world is the way it seems to us. But if that's not how we approach these sorts of matters, if instead we take a more balanced view and we say, well, I'm only going to start believing that the world is not the way it seems to me, if in fact I have good reason to believe that, then we're in a different kind of situation. Then we need to start seriously thinking about what sorts of reasons, or what kind of evidence do we have to suggest that the world is not really the way it is. Right? And we can think about that in terms of, say, The Matrix and Inception. Right? We can think about particular characters at particular points in that film. Right? Particularly Cobb and Neo stand out as the most interesting. What evidence do they have at certain points in those films to suggest that they are or are not stuck in a matrix or a dream? We can think about ourselves. What pieces of information do we have to suggest that we are or are not stuck in a computer simulation or a dream. It's going to be exactly this kind of issue that we're going to see in the next couple of readings. So we're going to see in Nick Bostrom, he's going to be putting forward an argument that, in fact, we've got pretty good reason to believe that there's sort of a cluster of potential beliefs there, but one of them is that we're actually in a computer simulation rather than experiencing the world as it really is. We're going to also look at a piece by Alan Haslat, who's going to approach these matters and introduce a few more recent technical terms out of epistemology, out of that theory of knowledge and philosophy, and really consider this issue about how should we approach our claims to knowledge about how the world really is. At what point would we be justified in saying, I don't think the world is really the way it seems to be, versus being justified as we typically think we are in believing that the world really is the way it seems to be. All right, I think I need to wrap this up. It seems like it's been about the sort of right length here, right amount of depth. One last quick comment is that Descartes himself, in trying to solve this kind of skeptical problem, if you're curious about that, ultimately throughout the rest of the meditations, he winds up going back to his belief in an all-good and all-powerful God existing as really being the thing that justifies him in believing that the world is the way it seems, right? Why? Because an all-good and all-powerful God just wouldn't be such a jerk to trick us the way the evil demon would into thinking that there were really, trees and rabbits and birds and bodies and books and whatever, when there weren't. That would just be, not the kind of thing an all-good and powerful God would do. But then how do we explain the fact that we sometimes make mistakes, right? Well, for this, Descartes says, of course, we're not perfect, right? We're not God. We are imperfect beings. Mistakes are a kind of imperfection in our knowledge. We have the power of choice. We have choice over what we do and what we believe. And so really mistakes come about when we exercise our capacity for choice wrongly and believe things that we don't have really good reason to believe. When we leap to conclusions and we make judgments based on, say, just our sensory experience, rather than really taking the time to work through and properly judge the evidence that we have and whether or not we should believe something. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's sort of the short version of where Descartes ends up. That might be a promising route to you, depending on other sorts of beliefs you have, but historically, including contemporaries of Descartes, raised some serious questions for him about that whole approach, because they said, it seems like you're assuming that there's an all-good and all-powerful God that exists, and that's your way of trying to justify our beliefs in things like, I'm actually sitting in my office right now, and that there's books over on that shelf and a painting behind me, and so on. I think I'll just leave it there. So it's a potentially promising avenue to go, depending on your own sorts of beliefs, but then there are serious questions in there about what kind of status does our belief in the existence of God have? Is that a more secure belief than our belief that, so when I turn around and just look at that bookshelf, my belief that there are books on that bookshelf seems pretty well justified, right, by all my sensory experience. Is my belief that there's an all-good and all-powerful God who wouldn't trick me the way the evil demon does, or even just sort of in general, is that belief as justified or as secure? An interesting area of controversy, right? That's certainly a controversial belief on which there are differing opinions. It's one we're not really going to get around to in this course, though it is a very interesting belief, and in the philosophy of religion, that's certainly an area to be explored. But at least for the sake of this course and the sake of this unit, we're going to shelve that kind of response. What Descartes goes on to try to do seems a little less promising than what some of the other things we're going to take a look at in this unit, at least seem to me in terms of the sense of how promising they are. So that's it for Descartes. I'll be back tomorrow, Wednesday, talking about Nick Bostrom's Are We Living in a Computer Simulation? Until then, I hope you're well, and bye for now.